Hey everyone, my name is Brian, and in this video we're going to take a look at building authorization middleware in Node. Let's get started. First, we want to get our development environment up and running. Right now I'm in an empty folder, and I'm going to run a simple docker run command that will create a container running Node and mount our current volume and ports for us. I like to use Docker a lot in my development because this gives me a consistent environment across different machines. Once we have Node up and running, let's create a new package JSON by running npm init, and I just passed the -y flag. From there, I want to go ahead and install npm express. So this will take a minute to install. Perfect. Now we need to create a new file. So we'll just call it app.js, and here we want to create a simple Node Express application. Now back in my Docker container that's running in my application, I like to use NodeMon for development. And NodeMon will watch for file changes and allow the node process to reload anytime a new file is changed. So once we get that installed in the environment, we can just use the NodeMon command. And because we're running in a Docker container, I found it works best if I pass the -L flag, and that's just helps NodeMon to watch the file changes. All right, let's go ahead and shrink this down and create a quick route here. So we'll use our app and create a get route. Let's call it customers. And we return in our callback the request and the response. And we'll just return a quick response, right? We're not doing any type of error checking or anything. We're just sending back a placeholder response here. And we can see NodeMon reloaded. And if we hit that route in our browser, we can now see that we have a response coming back. All right, and over in Postman, we can make the same request to our customer endpoint and see that we're getting our customer information response back, right? Just a little sanity check here. So now back in our code, we want to be able to verify that a user is authorized to do something, right? That's the whole point. We're building an authorization middleware. And to do that, I like to use JSON Web Tokens to manage user information. So I like to use a package called JSON Web Token. So let's go ahead and require that as a dependency. And we need to stop our NodeMon server and install that. So simple npm install JSON Web Token. All right. So now in our application, we can create just a dummy endpoint to get the new token. So again, this is where we're only authorizing a user here. We're not actually authenticating a user. So, disclaimer here, make sure that the user is authenticated before using an endpoint like this. But this will just return a JSON Web Token for us that we can then use in our application for testing. So here's a quick note about the disclaimer. Okay, so within our token endpoint, I'm just going to create a kind of a dummy payload. So again, this is information that we might get from another service, or we might get from our backend that tells us things like the user's name, maybe their email address, something like that. But we're just going to create a simple payload object here, and then we're going to pass that into a variable we call token, and we're going to use the JWT package that we pulled in to sign the token with our payload, and then we're passing in my super secret key. And so that's what we use to sign the token and return that signed token back to the requester, right? So we might use Postman or something to get that token back. Start up our application again. Now if we go to get/token, we can see we've returned a token here. We take that token payload and hop over to our browser again and go to a website called jwt.io. And so this is put together by our friends over at AuthZ. And here we can see in the token that in our payload we have our name Jimmy. Perfect. So that's basically what we passed in. So looks like our token endpoint is working. So now let's go ahead and extend our payload. And to do that, we're going to create a scopes parameter, and that will be an array. And in that array, let's just create one value. Let's call it customer :create. And so this is going to say that our particular user has the ability to create a new customer. So if we go back and try our endpoint again, get a new token, and then take that token over to jwt.io, we can see that our scopes array is there. Perfect. So this is kind of just a sanity check that we can see the information being passed around. Now that we have that information in our JSON Web Token, let's implement our authorization middleware. So basically this is going to be used to check our JSON Web Token to make sure that the current user has access to this information. So we'll do that by creating another file, and we'll just call it authorization-middleware.js, and in there, let's start by creating our file. So we need to pull in the JWT library again. So one of the things that this authorization middleware will do is to validate that the JSON Web Token is still valid, right? Make sure that it isn't expired and it doesn't have any, hasn't been tampered with in any way by the user. So like most all middleware in Node, we want to just return, and we pass in the request, the response, and a next into the callback, and we'll just do a quick console log to see that our authorization middleware is working. And we always want to call the next method just so that that callback allows the request to continue. So now if we bring that authorization middleware file into our main app.js, and then down here in our customer get endpoint, we just pass in the authorize option. And so as middleware, we can pass in these functions in order, and they'll be executed in order. Cool. So we could see that that didn't change anything, but we do see the console log down there that the authorization middleware was called. So we know the middleware is working, it's being called properly in order. Now we need to set it up to actually be useful for us. So let's see, the first thing that we can do here is we need to find the JSON Web Token, and we find that in the request. So that's passed in the headers, and we find that in the authorization header. That's what we've decided, where we've decided to pass that information. So we just create a quick variable called token and search in our headers for the authorization header. So we want to check and make sure that we have a token before we proceed. If there's no token there, then the user isn't considered to be authenticated with the application, and we should go ahead and kind of kick them out, return an error back to the requester. So we're just going to return a 401. That access was denied. Cool. But now if we do have a token, then we want to continue processing the request through our authorization middleware. So let's just test to see that working. So it is working. Let's see what's going on here. So we are just checking for a token. So everything looks okay in our middleware right now. All we're doing is testing to make sure. Let's go back. Oh, there it is. In Postman, I was already passing a header, an authorization header. So the request was working. So our if-else statement does work. But let's test it again. Cool. So there's the access denied error that we were expecting. And that's because we are not passing an authorization header anymore. So now if we pass something in the authorization, and right now it doesn't really matter because we're not actually testing the value of the token, we're just testing that that header exists. And that's why our else statement is working. But now we need to think about checking our token to make sure it is a token that we generated that we consider to be valid. So in our else statement, we want to do some validation on the JSON Web Token. We do that here. So we want to take a look at the token body, and we get to the body by first taking the bearer portion of the JSON Web Token away. So kind of a standard is to pass bearer, the word bearer, in front of the actual JSON Web Token, and so that takes up the first 7 characters of our token if it's passed that way in our header. And so now we use, again, the JSON Web Token library has its verify method, and in that verify method we are going to pass in our secret that we use to sign the token to then also verify it. But because that secret now needs to exist in 2 places, what I did was create a config file to hold that information. So I just created a new file called config.js, and in that object is just our secret. So now we pull it into our app.js file. And now we can reference it when we both sign the token and when we verify it. So if we hop back over to our authorization middleware, do the same import of the config file, And again, this type of information might be passed in as an environment variable or some other secure way of passing around a secret. But for our purposes here, I'm just going to put it into a config object. So now we verify it, and the verify method from this library returns again another callback with an error and the decoded payload. So we want to handle the error. If we do get an error, let's log it out to the console. In my error statements, I always like to identify where the error exists or where it happens, so that then I can easily debug it in the future. And again, because there was an error with the token, it could have been the token was expired or the token was had been tampered with. We want to again return a 401 an access denied error. Because that's information that a user could see, we don't want to really pass any sensitive information in the error message. But now if there isn't an error, then the token is considered to be valid, and we want to use the information in that token. Yep. We'll just move our next callback into the verify method. All right, so there's the access denied. Even though I'm passing in a valid header, it's not actually a valid token for the header body, or the header, I guess, payload. So let's go ahead and generate another token. Go over to our get customer test in Postman. I like to make some notes in my code to just remember why it is that I'm slicing off the first 7 characters, and that's because we're requiring users of this particular endpoint to pass in their authorization header information as a bearer token. So we just type bearer and then the payload, and now our check works. So basically what we have right now is we're checking to see that the user is passing in a valid JSON Web Token. Now we haven't done any authorization checks. We're just checking that we have a token that we would consider the user to have been authenticated. So now we need to do some work to actually authorize that user. So in our authorization middleware, we now want to pass a value, and so I'm looking for the customer create scope. So in this example, because my token doesn't have customer read, I'm going to use that to do some initial testing of the middleware as we create it. So what we expect to be passed into the middleware is a variable we'll just call credentials, and we'll set that to an empty array. And then if the user of our middleware passes in a string, we want to take that string and convert it to an array, because we'll use some array methods later on, and we just want to make sure that it's set up to work. So we'll just see if it's a string, and if it is, then we'll pass it into an empty array. Now if it were already an array, then we wouldn't have to worry about that. And we can do some additional type checking here if we want to, just to make sure that we're providing error messages to anyone using our middleware. So now we have our credentials being passed in, and we want to check to see if the array has a credential that we're actually interested in, or that our token has the correct scope. So the first thing that we'll do is check to see if credentials exist. So we want to look at that array. So we may either have, an empty string that was passed in, or just an empty array. And if that's the case, basically what we're telling our middleware is that we only want the user to be authenticated. We want them to have a valid JSON Web Token, but we don't really care about, the actual scope that they have. But if they do have a credential that's passed in to the middleware, then we want to check the scopes. And because we're still in the jwt.verify method, we have access to decoded.scopes, so the scopes object. And if what we're saying here is if we have scopes and if we have a scopes array, then we'll return, or we'll allow the middleware to pass through. But if that's not the case, then we want to return again an access denied error, because right now what we're saying is the user needs to have some credentials being passed in, but there are no scopes in the JWT that was passed. So again, just some comments. Usually, this is just going to help me in later down the road when I'm trying to remember how this works. We can see our server restarting. We go over there, our endpoint still works. And that's because we do have scopes being passed in. But in our token, we have the create scope, but in our middleware call, we're actually looking for the read scope. So we're not actually checking that this user is authorized. We're just checking that they have some scopes. So let's add into our if statement a check. So we want to look at the credentials array, and then we'll use the sum method. So sum will take the decoded scopes and look for an index of now let's try something different here. Let's try that again. So, and credentials, sum. So sum will kind of iterate over the credentials array, and then we'll reference each instance of the iteration with a cred, so just our kind of temporary value, and then we'll look for that cred to see if there's an instance of it in our decoded scopes. So basically what we're doing is looking for the specific scope in our JSON Web Token that matches credentials that were passed into our middleware. So if we go back to our app.js, we can see a mismatch between the scopes that I have in my JSON Web Token and the scopes that our authorization middleware are looking for. So now I get access denied. So now we have a working authorization middleware. Now if I go into my JSON Web Token payload and give myself the customer read scope, so I'm authorizing myself to read that information, go back over to jwt.io, I can see that my token has been updated. Now if we take this new token and go back to our get customer API request, update our header and pass that in through Postman, voila, now we see that we have access to the customer information endpoint, and we are authorized because we have that information defined in the scopes of our JSON Web Token. So now if I only had a single scope and I passed it in as a string, we can test that also by going over, updating our payload, and then getting our new token from our endpoint. Now we can see that scopes is being passed in as a single string. We can pass that information into our header, and it still works, right? Because we're looking for the instance of a string, and if that is what we receive into our middleware, then we convert it to an array, and then we can continue to use the same array methodology, right? So that is a simple, straightforward authorization middleware that works with JSON Web Tokens, and I hope that is helpful for you. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.